I think my problem is my eyes don't glaze over. I just don't, it's not my way of thinking. I'm too scientific, and philosophies.
Wow.
I took it when I was able to as a college senior because I had electives left, and it was fun, but it's hard. I think it's a hard thing for certain people. So,
well, I'll try to make it easier and more scientific for you, Mary Grace. We'll see if I succeed.
I appreciated your sermon, by the way, as a prologue to this.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And for all those who are now tuning in as a recorded version of this adult forum, welcome. This is the Parish of the Good Shepherd for the 4th Sunday in Lent 2022. This is our adult forum series on the rules of life. And let's see, where's my cursor? There it is. Where we're going now. Oh, come on. There we go. Oh, of course. So, as I said in my sermon, if you listened to that, we've been examining rules of life, rule of St. Benedict, rule of St. Augustine, the rule of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, right? And what are, at the root of it, what are these rules of life, right? They're documents intended to orient us to the good life, to say, how ought we live if we're going to be good and holy Christian men and women, right? So at the base of every rule of life, it's actually a practice of ethics. It's an exercise in figuring out ethics. And ethics has got applied ethics, there's meta-ethics, there's normative ethics. Normative ethics deals with what ought we do, what's moral, what's right. So this is philosophy 101 in some ways. This is why people often get into philosophy, right? They want to know what is right, what should I do? What is the good life? And this is very, very broad. But ethical theories, normative ethical theories, sort of fall into one of 3 camps: virtue ethics, deontology, and consequentialism. And I'm sort of going backwards, right? So I'll start with consequentialism. This says that our acts are good if they produce good results. So let's look at what happens, right? The sort of banner of this is the ends justify the means. Well, we have someone coming in. This is Mary Ellen. So the ends justify the means. One of the classic examples of consequentialism or a consequentialist ethical theory is communism, right? So we've got horrible inequality. Let's pool all of our resources and distribute them equally so that everyone has enough, right? That's focused on the outcome, the result, and if that is all good, well, then the practice, the communism or the communitarianism is a good ethical theory. That's what they would say. Or often hedonism, which you wouldn't think is an ethical theory, but it is, right? What gives me the most pleasure? What produces pleasurable outcomes? If it produces pleasurable outcomes, it's got to be good, right? So these are ethical theories that focus on the results. Deontology focuses on the intentions of the act itself. So is it being done according to the right duty? So what are the rules, right? The 10 commandments are deontological. Do not kill, do not covet, do not steal, right? These are things that you should not do. And the intention about not wanting to kill or not killing, or not wanting to steal or not stealing, this makes the act of not doing that good, right? Refraining from that is good. A lot of classical Enlightenment types of ethical theories are deontological. Immanuel Kant is sort of the forebear of deontological thought. Much earlier than that are virtue ethics. Sort of the first ethical systems that were set up in humanity were virtue ethics. Virtue ethics are a little bit different. They look at not the results of the acts, not the intentions of the acts, but the character of the actors. So what are the personality traits, the characteristics of the people? And if you are a person who is virtuous, if you follow certain virtues, if your character is a virtuous character, well, then by definition, you'll do good things, right? You'll have an ethical life. And what are the virtues? There's all sorts of virtues: compassion, courage, honesty, temperance. These are some that I list here. But focusing on the virtues in order to get to what is good and right is in some ways a very old way of thinking about ethics. It's pre-Enlightenment, pre-Western Enlightenment. Western Enlightenment thinks much more about rules, about order, about science, right? The age of reason. And of course, sort of sociologically, in the modern age, the outcomes, like what is actually being produced, right? This is either good or bad, right? It has nothing to do with the character of people. It has everything to do with the actual acts and results. And yet, when we look at rules of life, the rule of St. Benedict, the rule of St. Augustine, these are pre-Enlightenment rules. So they are actually, as much of Christian theology is, grounded in virtue ethics. It's not deontological, it's not consequentialist. It's actually virtue ethics that it's grounded in. And you can see that in our rules of life, right? They sort of ask, how do we be good? How are we good monks? How are we good nuns, right? What are some of the practices that we do? But why are we doing this, right? They always cite scripture, but underlying that scripture is a certain disposition, a certain character trait of ourselves that reflect the glory of God. And we'll see this in a couple of slides when we get back to rules of life. But I want to lay this out and talk about specifically virtue ethics, because that's where we're at in our adult form. So let me get to the next slide.
Michael?
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I got the impression, and now continues, in your sermon, you could have gone on for sentences with words that, are virtues. Generosity, love,
Exactly.
equity, forgiveness, mercy, fairness. I mean, righteousness, humility, equity, generosity.
Yeah.
Where do those words end?
Well, that's the next slide, Mary Grace. I will talk about the list of virtues. We're getting there. Patience. Patience is a virtue. I cracked myself up. Okay. So virtue ethics. This is, as I said, one of the oldest Western human ethical systems out there. It was sort of posited by Socrates in the 5th century before Christ, right? And it was refined by his pupils, Plato and Aristotle, in the 4th century. And again, these virtues and vices. So vices are sort of the opposite of virtues, right? If you might have a virtue, you might have a vice as its corollary, right? They are character traits. There's something about ourselves, right? That dispose a person to think or to feel or to act in a certain way. And if you have the right virtue, then by necessity, they believe, you get the right thoughts, feelings, and actions out of that, right? There are 2 types of virtues and vices. There are affective and intellectual virtues and vices. The affective are those that are part of our personality. They would be all of those things that you just listed, Mary Grace, like patience and compassion and mercy and courage and all these sorts of feeling type of virtues. The intellectual virtues are things that you can learn. And the next slide, I'll explain a little bit about this, but this little quadrilateral of terms is something that's used often in virtue ethics. Ultimately, we want to be virtuous, right? That is, we have all the right personality traits, the right virtues that, in addition to our affect, our emotions, we have good emotions. We also have good intellect. We've got a good brain. We can figure out what we should do, right? And our heart makes us want to do the right thing. And then our will is in accordance with that, and we do the right thing. This is sort of like the perfect combination. The opposite of being virtuous is being vicious, that is full of vices, right? So you got a bad brain. You don't know what you should do, right? You can't reason to what is moral. You also have bad emotions, in fact, sort of bad inclinations or bad dispositions. You kind of really want to do the wrong thing. And then you just don't really care. Your will is just like, you're lost and moreless, unmoored, I should say. None of us hopefully are vicious, right? But you can imagine people who just don't have any ethical core to them. They would be the vicious type of person. Most of us, however, sort of exist in these 2 poles in the middle. So again, there's different ways of cutting this, but these are the two ways of looking at this, continent and incontinent, which might be funny, but that's the technical term, right? Both of these are people much like you and I, right? We might have a good brain. We might know what we should do, right? We know what is good. We know what the good virtue is, the good path is. But oftentimes our heart is pulling us astray. We kind of want to sin. This is summed up beautifully in Paul's epistles, right? I know what I ought to do and I do not do it. And that which I do not want to do, that is what I do, right? That's sort of convoluted. I think it's Romans. That's this, right? We know what is right, and we struggle because our emotions want us to sin, right? And it comes down to whether we have the will, whether our will is strong enough to do the right thing or not, right? Do we give in to those baser emotions? Now, this is all FYI. Again, virtue ethics is an old way of thinking, and this might not be applicable, but you can see how virtue ethics made its way into our scriptures, right? This continence and incontinence is deep within Pauline theology. Paul often says that he wishes that he were more spiritual, more closely aligned with the will of God in Jesus Christ, and yet he is a fallen person. He fails all the time. He struggles. He sins. And that aspect of Pauline theology has, of course, influenced most of Christian theology. And it's all rooted in virtue ethics, right? Knowing what to do and then not having the heart to be able to do it, right? So what are these virtues and vices? Because I know Mary Grace is champing at the bit to get a succinct list. Oh, there they are. Okay. Well, you might have heard of the 4 cardinal virtues. This was actually espoused by Plato, and it was picked up by Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, in his great magnum opus of theology. He talks about these 4 cardinal virtues. So wisdom or prudence, right? This is our mind. Justice, what is right. Fortitude or courage, especially in the face of suffering. That's what fortitude is. And then temperance, sort of moderation, not being in excess of anything or deficient in anything, right? Temperate, very moderate. That's what Plato espoused. And Plato's apostle, his student, his pupil, Aristotle, came back and said, actually, no, there's 18 virtues, right? And Aristotle's system puts all the virtues right down the middle, and then he talks a little bit about what's on the extremes, right? So, for example, the first virtue is courage. This is an affective virtue. It's our heart with courage. But if we have too much courage, right, then we're rash. You know, we just go out into the world unthinkingly, sort of boldly, but probably stupid, right? And if we're deficient in courage, well, then we're cowards, right? That's what cowardice is, right? So there's these 2 extremes, and the mean, the sort of the temperate mean, is the virtue, what we should aim for. And you can see he has all of these affective virtues: courage, temperance, liberality, right, which is actually what we might call generosity, right? You could be illiberal or mean, sort of stingy, right? Or you could be prodigal. Prodigal means sort of almost exuberantly wasteful in how you give, right? A virtue that we don't usually encounter today, but magnificence. This is a sense of the king, right? The king is a magnificent person. Why? Because he can be, it's kind of like it's kind of like generosity, but generosity on a kingly level. So magnificent people are those who are magnanimous. Well, that's another one, right? Giving. But in a way that bespokes taste and appropriateness. So magnificence is not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the king who is vulgar and tasteless, sort of over the top. You know, you could imagine maybe Becca Ehrlich, right? Someone who's a Christian minimalist might not be that magnificent, but there's sort of a mean magnificence or an average magnificence. Magnanimity, right? Giving. Ambition and pride. We think of pride as a sin, but pride could actually be a virtue, sort of pride in oneself, sort of a self-esteem, honestly, recognizing our self-worth. We are creatures of God, and by virtue of being a created being of God, we have worth, and we should be acknowledging that worth and be proud of that worth, right? if we have too much, right, we're too ambitious. We have sort of empty vanity, and we have undue humility if we don't recognize our worth, right? If we don't have pride in ourselves and in our projects. Other things: patience, truthfulness, wittiness, friendliness, modesty, and righteous indignation. That sort of ends the affective virtues, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There are 12 affective virtues in Aristotle's list. And then there's 6 more that would be the intellectual virtues. So these are things that we can learn. So our intelligence, we can work our brains out, right? And again, this does not correlate to a lot of contemporary understandings of human beings and how we are constructed. It's very sort of Platonic. It's very Hellenistic, the sense of the self, where we have bodies, minds, and souls. This is not how we often break apart a human being today. But these other virtues: intelligence, science, theoretical wisdom, good sense, understanding, excuse me, practical wisdom, and art and craftsmanship, so skill. I think the takeaway is that your list of virtues is what you want to make of it, right? There is no set list out there to say, aha, here are the virtues that we need to follow. So my apologies, Mary Grace. I cannot give you a definitive list of virtues. Your virtues, the ones that you discern for yourself, will be for you. And when we come to make our own rules of life, we're going to have to discern what are the virtues, what are the characteristics of a good life, a good Christian life, that are important to us. Sort of magnanimity or generosity certainly might be very important, but maybe courage isn't, right? Maybe courage is not something important for you. It might be important for someone else. Friendliness, that might be high on your list, and maybe truthfulness. I don't know, you're gonna have to choose which virtues work for you. And again, these are Aristotle's virtues, so things that you don't see on here: mercy, right? Or love. Those are certainly virtues, important ones, right? Important Christian virtues, but they're not here on this list. So something to realize. Okay, let's go back to, this is the Society of the rule of the Society of St. John the Evangelist. This is the rule again, all of the different chapters. And if you think about it, if you look at these and sort of just look at the chapter titles, you might actually discern what sort of virtues undergird their life together. Well, there's certainly the vows that they take. They take vows of poverty, celibacy, and obedience. These are the vows that they take. And within that, you can see some virtues, right? So vows of poverty might be a vow of humility, right? Humility or humbleness before others could be a virtue. Celibacy and obedience are both sort of a value of actually obedience, right? Of sort of putting before us an authority, either an external authority, like the superior of the order, the monk in charge, or even putting before our baser urges, our sexual urges, our will. So we're putting forth our will, and celibacy is being obedient to a principled self, a principled will. So obedience and humility, for me, I see those within their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Chastity could also be temperance, right? So chastity, we commonly think of it as like not having sex, but it's more than not having sex. Chastity really is having an ordered and principled self in relation to our passions. So not gorging ourselves on food and drink, right? That could also be a way of being chaste. It's not strictly speaking about sex, although it is definitely, but it's also about directing all of this energy towards Christ is really what happens for the monks, right? All of this frustrated sexual energy or energy around sort of over the top passions, whatever it is that could be your potential vice, right? It might be a love of food or drink. It might be cigarettes. It might be anything that if you give into it, sort of subsumes your life and sucks you in. That energy, put it aside and redirect it towards worship of God in Jesus Christ. And that's sort of what chastity is for them, if you read their chapter on chastity. So it could be temperance, but for me, it's also about obedience, right? What are the other things in here? I'm looking at the list. Guidance, reconciliation, mission and service, hospitality, right? Or the graces of friendship, right? There's a lot of this rule that orients people to community, to relationship with other brothers, other members of the community. And so friendliness or an interest and value of relationship, or mutuality, perhaps. There's different ways of looking at any of these virtues and naming a virtue for yourself. So this is what's popping out for me, but you might perceive other values within this list of chapters. Generosity, right? So hospitality is about generosity, and the brothers are very generous. They will share their meals with anyone who comes to their door. They will freely give whatever they have. If you say, I kind of need something right now, and they'll be like, here, take it. They are very, very generous and hospitable. The gifts and challenges of old age, right? The maturing of our minds in Christ. For me, this is about curiosity or staying open to other potentialities. The monks at SSJE are a learned order. They encourage all of their monks to study, to get degrees. And that disposition of always learning something keeps them open to the ways in which Christ invites them into new ways of being. So in some ways, keeping an open mind keeps them open to the Spirit as well. So this is a virtue. Curiosity could be a virtue. Now, let's see. Okay, yes, I'm gonna go back to this. If you remember what I said in my sermon, virtue ethics are all well and good, right? Figuring out what virtues and principles we should follow, but you can't practice all these virtues at once. If you actually have a good balanced blend of virtues, by nature, they're going to contradict one another. You can't be righteously indignant, right? You cannot be focused on justice as fairness, and at the same time be humble and a person of humility, because one type of virtue is calling you out of yourself to engage practically with an ego, right? With our mind, with ourself. And another one is calling us to withdraw and to become deferential to other people. And you really can't practice both of those at the same time. So with whatever types of virtues you're going to find for yourself, when we come to our own rules of life, just be aware that these are not virtues you are always practicing all the time. But like a toolbox, you'll pull out a virtue and say, aha, this is applicable at this point and at this time, right? And my hope is that you will have such a diversity of virtues that you can have exactly the right virtue for any type of occasion. This is really what I wanted to cover in terms of virtue ethics. Next week, I'm sorry, going the wrong way. Next week, we'll talk about our own personal rules, right? The Society of St. John the Evangelist is a wonderful order of monks, and they encourage people to write their own rules of life, such that they have already prepared my adult forum next week for me. Before the pandemic, they actually had an entire workshop series on crafting your own rule of life. So I actually have a workbook from them that I'll be working out of, and I can share this with anyone who wants to endeavor to create their own rule of life. What are the steps that you take to reflect, to draft? What are you reflecting on? What are you studying about? And what is the purpose of your rule of life? All of these things will go into the process, and then we'll cover that next week. So this is a very brief overview of virtue ethics and why I think we should talk about character in order to get to the good life, right? The rules of life that we've been looking at, St. Benedict, Augustine, they are, as you would point out, Mary Grace, not very scientific, right? They're impressionistic. Sometimes they talk about very concrete things, like what you should do to repent, to express grief and sorrow of having sinned, right? And what the superior or the abbot of the order needs to do to correct and punish wayward monks. So it seems very consequentialist in some ways. And then other times it's all about generosity, ways of being loving in the world that aren't moored to specific actions. And so you get a sort of a pastiche of different ethical styles within rules of life, which is why I wanted to focus strictly on virtue ethics, because I think if we approach it through one lens, it helps crystallize the entire project. So next week, when we come to our own rules of life, I'll encourage us to think through the lens of virtue. What are the things that are good for us, the character traits, the virtues that we should have? And if we are practicing this virtue, what will that then look like for our life, and put that into our rule of life? So that's where I wanted to end for today. Thoughts, questions, comments about this or about my sermon, since the two kind of weave together?
I was thinking that virtue ethics could easily seep into consequentialism, not that you're trying to make them separate, but I mean, you're presenting them separately, but you weren't suggesting this could not happen. But because I was thinking, say on the virtue ethics, you were thinking of compassion. That was one of the ones that you had on that slide. And say you're a cop and you feel that compassion is one of your strong points, or that is important to you, and you come upon a car that's parked in a completely illegal spot, in front of a fire hydrant or something at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you get out of the car and there's we'll make it a mother, it could be a father, but there's a mother in there and she's got 2 kids in the back seat asleep and doesn't have a place to live because she's scared to death to go home to her husband because he beats her or something. And she doesn't even have her driver's license with her because she literally sneaked out of the house with the kids. And the cop can't bring himself. He's not going to arrest her. It's 2 a.m. He's not going to call a social worker and wake up the children. And he says, move the car over there. That's a legal spot. You need to get going on something in the morning. I don't want to see you here in the morning, but here's the number of a social worker place. And the cop just drives away. And, so the ends justified the means. He can think, or she as a cop, in her mind, because yes, I didn't give her a ticket for parking by a fire hydrant or for driving without a license. But the end was that she got to keep away from that abusive husband, and the kids are still safe with her in the car. And I think of myself as a compassionate person. I mean, it doesn't go with the deontological one, because if the cop had been going with the rules, but if the cop had gone with the rules, the cop would have said, you're not allowed to drive without a license, and you're not allowed to park in front of a fire hydrant. So the rule is I have to give you a ticket. So it doesn't really go with that one, but they could all intertwine here, but you think it could be.
So this is the thing. I love this example, by the way. This is what people studying ethics do all the time. They come up with a hypothetical and they're like, well, let's apply consequentialism, let's apply deontology, and let's apply virtue ethics to this example. And how would each of those thought processes work out? So you sort of laid out the consequentialist answer, which is, okay, what is the best possible solution for this mother and for myself as a cop and for the social worker who's currently asleep at home, right? For everyone involved, what is the best possible outcome? Right, so I'm gonna have her move over, get in a legal spot. She's got contact information for the morning. This person's not arrested. She gets to stay with her children. Not ideal situation all around, but probably the best possible one. Excellent. You've gotten consequentialism in there. A deontologist, if this cop were a deontologist, he would look at his rules. Now, there are the rules that he's been given as a cop. What are the laws of society, right? But he might also have personal rules himself. He might have a rule that is, I protect vulnerable people, right? Now, that might actually conflict with other rules that he has. This is the thing. The problems with ethical theories are always the internal conflicts. That's a hint. That's why ethics is never going to be solved, right? No matter which way you go, you're going to have internal conflicts to ethics. That's what keeps people like me in business for so long. I get to work this out and I'll never get to a resolution. But he would have, or she would look at his list of rules, or her list of rules. I protect the innocent. I'm a servant of society. I apply the law that's been given to me. And I apply it evenly and unbiasedly, right? And I might even have a law that says, given certain deficiencies in society, it is important to show preferential treatment to those who are disadvantaged in certain ways. Deontologists sort of get bogged down with rules, and they tend to be almost too much in their brain because they are thinking about what their right intention should be. And then once they get that clear, boom, they act, right? And it's fine. But figuring out which rule in their head is the one that is the most important would be what a deontologist does. Most of us are not deontologists in practice, right? We don't go through the world thinking about rules and which rule or which duty we have at any given moment. We just sort of act, right, from our gut, which is why virtue ethics is still around today, because virtue ethics, in some ways, is in a line with how people actually are. If we do any work, it's on ourselves, right? We do homework on ourselves to become better people. And then we trust if we're better people, well, we'll just happen to do better things, right? We will live in a more moral and ethical way. But we sort of work on our personality, on ourselves, and we don't work on every individual action and figure out what's the moral choice within every specific action. We do for maybe big decisions, right? Big moral choices. We might sit down and think about the consequences or which duties and rules we should be following. But for most everyday actions, we don't think about the moral consequences or the moral duties that go into it. We just sort of act, which is why virtue ethics is important, because a virtue ethicist, if this police officer were a virtue ethicist, he or she, long before maybe they went into the police force, would think about what are the virtues, what are the characteristics that I care about? I care about justice, I care about fairness, I care about compassion, for example. And, I've worked on myself to such a degree that when I'm thrown out into the world and face a moral choice like this one with this woman in a car, I'll trust that what I'm doing will be right because I've sort of weighed my virtues. Now this is how it's supposed to go, but it doesn't always go that way because again, virtues conflict. And do we trust ourselves to go with our gut virtue in the moment, right? So maybe this police officer for the entire week has been sort of leaning into the virtue of justice, like following their playbook, doing everything according to the law that's correct, right? And trusting that all of this is just. And then now they're being thrown for a loop that maybe justice, what is correct, is in fact not what should be pursued. Maybe you should pursue something that's a little bit unjust or unfair. You may want to give this woman some preferential treatment, something that she doesn't deserve. And that might be the good thing. And hopefully, if this police officer is a virtue ethicist, they've practiced enough in their mind and in their heart to make that agile switch, to say, okay, I'm going to put aside fairness and the law for a moment and actually be a little bit more compassionate in this moment.
Well, Michael, it's interesting. That's why you do what you do. And why I'm the cynic is because this assumes, I mean, if you take the person who's the cop, is he 20 or is he 45? And where is he on his Maslow's?
Yes.
And so you give a lot of credit to the human being, and I'm at a place right now where I don't give a lot of credit to and that's why developing rules for yourself are so important. But as you said, the solution to the problem is only to realize that you're the father, the son, the older son, and younger son, and that you and it's not pure. You can't if you're practicing one ethic today and trying to, you can't, like you said, you can't do them all at the same time. So you've got a list that you can't even always obey all the time. So that's why all this is really hard for me.
Well, so I would say be gentle with yourself, right, Mary
Well,
Grace? And this is another problem with all ethics. Not only do different rules or different virtues or even different outcomes conflict, right? So it's not clear which path you should take. It's also the problem of universality. So does this ethical system work for everyone at every age in every culture? And the answer is generally no, right? It's usually old white men who've developed these things, right?
Wouldn't that be easy if it did, huh?
Yeah. And so, but what I can say is that we human beings are all we've got, right? We're the ones who have to make the moral choices. God is not going to do it for us. We have to figure it out for ourselves, which means chances are whatever we come to is going to be problematic and insufficient in certain ways. And that's the learning curve, that we have to be able to accept that eventually. You know,
well, you think of the protesters in Russia, and they're being put in jail because they're being virtuous.
Right.
They think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. So that's another great example, right? Their virtue might say, yes, you protest authoritarianism, even if it leads to suffering, even if it leads to death, right? Truth is their virtue, right? Be truthful, be honest, call out righteous indignation in the face of injury, call out evil. These are great virtues. Another way of approaching it would be the sort of the consequentialist approach to ethics, which would say, they're not going to change the regime by protesting. They're going to be crushed, right? So what's the outcome? Not great for them. Although martyrdom has some weight, right? Martyrdom actually might bring about change down the road. So you could do this, but this is the problem. Most of us don't know the outcomes of our actions. This is why consequentialism is another problematic ethical theory, because you don't know what you do, what it will ultimately produce. And what are the rules that you could follow if these protesters were deontological, right? I must always stand up for truth. I must call out, evil. Not from a virtues, not from a character standpoint of this is what I desire to do, but this is purely intellectual. This is what is right and what you ought to do.
But you're making up those rules, though. I mean,
I'm just trying to imagine what.
Yeah, but when I talked about the cop, I was talking about, and I prefer your rules, but I mean, I was talking about like the rules, like the rule is you can't drive without a license, or you can't park behind you. So
yeah, in deontology, Dawn, the rules, the duties are frequently rules and duties interior to ourselves, the things that we decide. Sometimes it's what society decides, and sometimes it's what society decides and writes down in the law books, right? But it's not always that, and it's mostly not that, right? It's the rules that govern our life. And if you're a deontologist, you're going to create the rules that for yourself are the guardrails for a good life. But yeah, sorry if it's confusing when I talked about rules or duties. It's not always, or even mostly, the law books. It's not what society deems as lawful. It could be, but not always. Other thoughts, questions? Yes, Mary Ellen, I see your hand.
I'm thinking, as you've related what you're teaching on ethics and these principles of life, of a way of life, it matches the prodigal sons. It matches both sons and their stories. And I'm kind of thinking, how do we come into this world? How do we figure it out in our life that we, at different stages, will realize that virtue has value? And the prodigal son is at a stage where he says to the father, can I just give me your inheritance? And within a couple of days, he sells and becomes dissolute. And it takes him quite a while to come back and be repentant. And then the other son actually becomes angry when his brother returns and he's been given the banquet. But yet the father is so understanding of that anger. I've read that since we've had Bible study Tuesday night. I've read it and contemplated, thought about it, and church this morning, it read again your sermon. And I looked at it in this discussion we had at Bible study the other night, that the father doesn't, they use the word anger, that the older son, he becomes angry and he refuses to go in to the banquet and the wonderful dancing party with his brother. But then at the end, the father doesn't chastise him for that moment of anger that he had. It almost seems that he kind of understands him, but then he just says, son, you're always with me. All that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. So that's the important thing of the points of life. Everybody is maybe given the same start just because we have life, but then on this journey of this life that we are given, we have to figure out the path somehow, with if we can figure it out with God's help, that there's a path of this virtuous life. I imagine that the older son did go into the party. I imagine that he did go into the party eventually.
Hopefully he did.
No, I think the father spoke to him. So, I'm going to have to take this call.
Okay,
Bye.
Great. So, it is an interesting parable, and maybe contrary to what Mary Ellen just said, the father does focus on reconciliation. The most important thing is that he has his son back, and everyone should celebrate regarding that. The father actually doesn't address the older son's primary complaint, which is, hey, you've never given me even a young goat to celebrate with my friends. Yeah, I know everything that you own is mine. I'm going to inherit everything, but you've never shown me the preference that you're clearly showing for your younger son. And that hurts, right? And the father doesn't address that. He just sort of glides right over that and says, no, what's important is that everyone is here, right? This is why, the father's virtue is a virtue, right? It's generosity and mercy and togetherness. Family, right, is a virtue for him. But that's not in line with what's fair, or even what's maybe kind for the older son. And that's why this parable, I think, is so compelling, because every character in there might have a good argument for why they're doing what they're doing. But no one character has got it all right. And that's because no matter what virtuous path we take, we're closing ourselves off to other virtues. That's the reality. We have all this diversity of choice before us, but once we make a choice, once we do something, we've closed ourselves off to other possibilities. And in that moment, right, there's always future moments where you can do something different yet again. But every action that we take is hard. Every moral action that we take is hard because it closes us off to other moral actions that we could have taken. And I just want to highlight that, that maybe that's why the parable of the prodigal son is so compelling, because, gosh, every character there has got a case to be made.
Yeah, and maybe fairness isn't a great virtue necessarily, I mean,
Possibly.
Maybe it's what is fair?
That's a great question, Mary Grace. Have entire philosophy courses on what is fair. Yeah, it's a great question. So maybe fairness shouldn't be in one of your virtues. Maybe it's not something that is important to you. Maybe it's not something that's important to the Christian faith, right? Maybe this faith is inherently an unfair faith. There's a sense that we don't want God to deal with us as we ought to deserve, right? We're grateful that God is actually merciful, because if God actually dealt with us as we deserved, who could stand, who could live,
Yeah.
right?
Well, fairness gets complicated because you think of communism, you think of Cuba, and all the people who had gave to the people who didn't, and that wasn't so fair. But so fair and equitable and being rich or being poor, giving to the poor, yeah, that's a whole circle that is really difficult to.
Well,
are you a bad person because and Dawn talked about this way back when. Are you a bad
We've
person
talked about
because
this.
you've
I
got
think
money and the other guy doesn't? Is that fair? Well, it's not fair. So yeah.
so. Again, and we've talked about this, I think the solution is to realize that none of these virtues are universal, constant, and true at all times, right? That sometimes, yes, you need to be generous, you need to give, and there are other times when you need to take care of yourself, have pride, right, in yourself, and self-esteem, and self-worth, and cultivate your own gifts and your own possessions, and at times you need to give it away too. So there's always change within life in Christ. So I think that is something to hold on to. And we're almost out of time. So I will just put this out here that when we start thinking for next week about our own rules of life, over the course of this coming week, just sort of reflect on what values, even if they're conflicting values, what sort of values are important to you, or should be important to you in a life of Christ. And don't think, concrete and universal and constant, right? So yes, giving money to the poor is all well and good, but if you take that to the extreme and you give everything away, well then, oh gosh, now God, I'm anxious, right? You don't have to go to the universal extremes of everything. Just say generosity or charity.
You have to be consistent.
Mary Grace's example, though, I love about the protester in Russia, because they're doing that because, Putin is a monster and these things are horrible. And so I'm impressed with that. And then I'm thinking, what if that person had a family at home? And what if that person were the only breadwinner? And by going out and protesting, they might get thrown in jail. And now they've left their children and spouse poverty stricken. Was that a moral thing to do? And to take it farther, what if they were forced to sign some statement in order to get released that said, Putin is wonderful and I hate Ukraine, and they actually signed it because they decided that the higher good was their spouse and children rather than what is right. It's just so complicated. It's mind-boggling,
So that's for next week, to get into the nitty-gritty of what our rule of life will be. Right now, just sort of hold up in your hearts different virtues. So honesty and truthfulness is a virtue. Confronting evil and protesting evil might be a virtue. And caring for my family and providing for my loved ones is a virtue. And you don't have to try to weigh those, specifically in particular events, right? We'll get to that. That's where we always want to go. But just sort of listing what your virtues are might be where we're at right now. Okay.
And it's a struggle to be consistent in those, isn't it? Obviously.
Well, so this is the thing, that a good ethicist, a good classical ethicist would say, yes, you must be consistent. And what I'm coming back and saying is, well, no, life is about evolution and change, right? And I think it might actually be okay to have a slightly different focus in your virtues and your ethics at some points of your life, as opposed to at earlier points. That's fine. Right. In fact, I actually think that's a sign of a good ethical life, one that might grow and change with you. If you are so rigidly stuck in an ethical system that you're applying it in one way at age 25 and at age 70, I think there's something wrong with that, right? This upholding of universal truth is actually not a sign of truth. So anyway,
to drink
that's my personal belief.
Right. To drink and drive fast at 18 isn't looking quite so good at 70.
Right. Or, there's the common aphorism, right? I think it's attributed to Churchill, but you need to be a liberal. If you're not a liberal when you are a youth, you have no brain, and if you're not a conservative as an old person, then you have no head, or you have no heart. Right? It's something I'm getting it all mixed up, but yeah,
I got.
I think Google it. But yes, you need to, in some ways, change your values as life progresses, right? So what is important in youth is very different in midlife and in late life.
So much for critical race theory, huh?
So much for a lot of stuff, right?
Don't change.
Anyway, I think we're at time. Any last comments or questions? Things that Joy or Mary Grace or Dawn you want to say before we log off?
I don't know if I should thank you for the headaches I get every Sunday after I listen to you, or
Oh.
be grateful.
Well, if you were a consequentialist, you
think-
should curse me because I'm causing you pain. If you were a deontologist, you might say, well, the headaches are worth it because I'm learning something great. And if
Right.
you're a virtue ethicist, you'd be like, well, I need to work on my fortitude and my patience. And if I were able to do that, I won't have headaches at all.
Okay, I'll take one of each.
Great.
Well, I'll say just in closing that it's so much. So I took a picture of each screen.
Oh,
I know it will be on the video, but I took the picture and I'll be looking at that
okay.
throughout the day. And I really appreciate your screen sharing of, you're
Okay.
just so organized. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Joy. I
Great
try to.
class. Yeah,
I
great
have a
class.
very organized mind. So that is a tell of me that what I present, even if what I'm presenting is not actually organized, I try to force order onto it because that's the way my brain works. But hopefully for people like maybe you, Joy, and Mary Grace, certainly, this isn't something that's helpful. And maybe you too, Dawn. I don't know if you're someone who has a scientific mind, but
Do you have a sense whether people are actually taking advantage of the recordings?
I don't know. I need to check. But you know what? If they do or they don't,
No, I'm just
I'm
curious. I hope they are.
I hope so too.
Because you've
I
done a
always
lot
hope
of-
that people.
You've done a
listen.
lot of work on those, on your slides, and I appreciate that.
I hope that some young people, it reminds me of what Mary Grace said when we did the book by Becca, whatever. And towards the end, several of us, Mary Grace was going, who's this written for? And she and I were totally agreeing, like, I don't know, this book isn't really for me, And we all said, and you said, yeah, it's probably really more for people in their 30s and 40s, kind of on life turning. And every single person at your class was 70 plus, so it was kind of telling that, it's too bad that there weren't some, and maybe they do go back and listen to it because it might have been really helpful.
Yeah, use it for the confirmation class.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for these recommendations. And I do have some great texts that are more for sort of end of life. Not that you guys are at the end of your life, but later life, I should say. Reflections.
Careful.
I know. I would love to bring them to bear, right? Because a lot of what I've studied obviously is for me, and look how young I am, right? And it might not be applicable for everyone, especially for a lot of parishioners here at Good Shepherd. But I'm open to bring. I cannot wait to share what I'm going to do for the Easter season. Father Jay said we have to wait to announce it. I think this coming Sunday we'll announce it. But Joy, you will be so pleased as to what we're going to do. I think both of you, Dawn and Mary Grace, also will be very pleased. But it's going to be something that I think is right up Good Shepherd's alley.
I just lost my patience. Why are you making us wait? If we promise not to tell,
No,
I mean,
Well, really, it's just the three of you.
Yeah, I promise. I'm like,
Okay, hold on. Did I stop? Oh yeah, I stopped recording. I think I did, right?
no, it's
Oh,
flashing.
okay.